Добър вечер! Радвам се да ви поздравя с предстоящата лекция, която е част от нашата информационно-образователна програма във връзка с изборната реформа. Както тези от вас, които са следили нашите лекции и дебати в последните 3 седмици знаят, ние правим една серия от събития. Стартирахме на 23 януари с представяне на изборните системи в по-теоретичен аспект. След това коментирахме профила на българския избирател и изборното му поведение. През миналата седмица имахме интересен дебат на тема мажоритарна или пропорционална система, коя е по-подходяща за България. И тази седмица продължаваме с темата за електронното гласуване. Все въпроси, които са в фокуса на общественото внимание във връзка с искането за референдум, което президента Плевнелиев посочи като една съществена задача. Ние имаме специален гост днес. Това е доктор Робърт Кримър. Робърт Кримър е един от водещите специалисти по електронно гласуване в света. Той е от седмица в Талинския технически университет като консултант на естонското правителство по въпросите за сигурността в връзка с електронно гласуване и електронно правителство. Преди това работеше в Полша в Организацията за сигурност и сътрудничество в Европа по темата нови технологии за гласуване. Преди това е бил в Центъра за компетентности за електронно гласуване в Австрия и въобще има сериозна експертиза по въпроса за електронното гласуване, както и доста собствени разработки. Изключително се радваме, че доктор Робърт Кримър се съгласи да направи тази лекция за нас. Тя ще бъде на английски език, с оглед на това да имаме достатъчно време за онлайн дискусии и въпроси, на които той ще отговори в рамките на следващия час. След презентацията си в четвъртък ще продължим с темата за електронно гласуване в една дискусия, която ще даде обществения и политически контекст на електронното гласуване. Сега бих искала да кажа добър вечер на доктор Робърт Кримър и да му дам без закъснение възможността да продължи с лекцията по същество. Доктор Кримър.
Thank you also for the invitation to be able to present on electronic voting to you and your audience. Maybe as a start, I can give a brief background why I work on electronic voting for quite a while now. And actually, it came out of a personal situation that I was in. I was actually an exchange student back in the time when the internet was really booming. That was in 1999. And I was studying at Vienna University, and I could do an exchange program with New York University in the United States. And so I was over there, and at the same time elections happened back home in my home university. And I thought when internet made it possible that Amazon hit the bookstores for the first time at that time, and actually the turnover of the university bookstore just declined just because everybody bought their textbooks at Amazon. I thought when you can buy your books online, why can't you vote online? And that was really one of the things when I started to look into this issue. I first thought it's a very easy one, but it turned out that it was actually a bit more difficult. And over the past years, I have done several projects where I actually consulted on the implementation of electronic voting, where I looked into the reasons why electronic voting is adopted or why it's not adopted. As well as in the past 3.5 years, I was the senior advisor on new voting technologies for the OSCE Office for Democratic Institution and Human Rights in Warsaw. And as part of that, my task was really to look into what is the added value of electronic voting? Where does it actually make sense? And I would like to give you a brief overview in this talk about where we stand right now and where the major challenges of why it's not that easy to do that just within a short time period, and what it actually can take. But let me first come to why there is actually something that is the context within this move. Couple of years that more and more electronic tools are used in elections, and we can say so that while in the very beginning of democracy we had face-to-face societies, may they be in Rome, in Athens, with the Vikings, in the Italian city-states, or until today in the Swiss Landsgemeinde, you will find people talking to each other, making decisions for whatever is within their realm. So within the city borders, so they can actually still see themselves. And for that, paper-based elections work quite well. When territorial societies evolved out of those smaller units in the French Revolution or the United States in the 18th century, there was actually need to develop new methods, new ways of making a choice happen. Yeah, to come up with a consensus in a bigger group. And so we developed more sophisticated voting methods. While they were in the beginning not secret, but public, they were done using rogatories or other methods of collecting the will. Nevertheless, over time, we developed a quite sophisticated method, what we now know as the polling station paper-based voting that we all know. However, we have now, in the past 20 years, one new challenge that completely transforms our daily life, and that is the availability of the internet, of information anywhere, anytime. And with that, actually, it also means that not only our information patterns change, but also the way of who is affected by our decisions. That means we need to develop in one way or the other in the near future a possibility to make decisions on larger than just on a territorial scale, but maybe bridging borders of language, bridging borders of countries. And we need to find a way how to do that. The problem is that so far our technology challenges it quite a lot. Now we'll go into more detail a little bit later. So the one question that drove my research for so long is really, when one can buy everything online, why is voting electronically not that easy? Why can't you just do it like this? And actually, one that already captured this problem very early on was David Zuckerman in 1925, quite a long time ago. He was not actually working on electronic voting, but he was working on mechanical voting. As such, it was in the 20s when the mechanical voting machines in the United States were on the rise. They were adopted one state after another. And in particular, New York City was one of the last cities where pull lever machines were not used yet in the New York State. And so David Zuckerman was charged to make a feasibility study for the Republican Party. And he actually came up with one sentence: presumably the voting machine does require an act of faith on the part of the voter in a mechanical contrivance whose workings he cannot see. No more so, however, than is required in the case of the automobile in which he drives up to the polls. You will find the sentence, maybe in slight modification, just replacing the automobile with the airplane and with the voting machine with an electronic voting machine. But you can find exactly the same thing in modern studies on electronic voting, where there is just argued that, oh yes, the voter just needs to trust into the system because he will not be able to understand. And why will he not be able to understand? Because he doesn't see bits and bytes. And that's exactly the problem. We cannot see how an electronic voting machine works. We can only deduct by accepting that it's a black box, what comes in, what comes out. The problem is we don't know what is happening in there. And that is one thing that really makes electronic voting and every mean very difficult, and we need to find solutions for that. But let me come back to this major problem. So what is electronic voting per se? Electronic voting, by the definition of the Council of Europe, is the use of electronic means and at least the casting of the vote. For me, this definition is a bit too narrow. I would extend it not only to the casting of the vote, but also add in the counting of the vote. So meaning using electronic means in counting and casting of the vote. And if you use that, then you can define three major types of electronic voting and counting. And the first one being actually the counting. That is using paper ballots and scan them and doing only the counting electronically. And then there are two more methods that I will come to in a bit. So how does e-voting work? I just realized that I skipped this one slide. So how does electronic voting work? It basically works on the separation between the unique identification of the voter and the casting of the vote. So meaning you have those two entities, one which is identified, one which is anonymous, and you need to keep them separated. And that is actually not only the case for electronic voting, but also for paper-based voting as well. So we have first the voter approaching the table with the voter lists. He or she identifies him or herself, then gets a paper ballot or an electronic ballot, goes to the ballot box, goes to the ballot booth, fills out the ballot, and then puts it into an envelope, and that envelope goes into the ballot box. So while the first process is identified, the second one is anonymous. And the one thing which shouldn't happen is that those two processes are linked. And that could happen, for example, through IP addresses, message content, sequence, time, basically additional information. So this separation of those two processes only works when you have a limited amount of information available. If you have all information available, then this is not possible. Yeah? Think about, for example, paper-based processes where you would have a fingerprint database. If you have all fingerprints of all the population, there is no secret paper ballot anymore. Okay, so you need to keep certain things private. So let me come back to the forms of electronic voting. As I mentioned before, optical scanners, they can capture only the electronic counting. And if we go the second method, which is electronic voting machines, they do cast the vote electronically and count it electronically. So they're a bit more complex. They're not only counting it, but also casting the vote electronically. And then we have the internet voting, where you do three things at the same time, where you identify the voter electronically, where you cast the vote electronically, and later also count the vote electronically. So here you really have that problem of how you're going to make sure that you have the separation of those entities of the voter and the vote. But in the separation, let me make one analogy. When you look at this matrix that you see in front of you, you have two dimensions. One dimension is the place of where the vote gets cast, meaning is it a controlled environment like the polling station or an uncontrolled environment like at home, meaning who is making sure that the voter is not coerced? Is it an election commission or the voter, him or herself? And in a polling station, it's the election commission. At home, the voter has no control and he can always be coerced. And if you look at the second dimension, that's the medium on which the vote is cast. And here you can have on the one hand side paper-based processes, and that will be in the controlled environment, the classical ballot sheet, the process that we all know. And then in the terms of uncontrolled environments where you cast the vote, that's the postal voting. So meaning postal voting has the same problem as some forms of electronic voting, which means that you are always it's always possible to influence the voter. So meaning influence them through coercion or vote buying. When we talk about electronic voting, then the use of electronic voting machines is going to happen in polling stations, and internet voting is going to happen in an uncontrolled environment. So both postal voting and internet voting share the problem of voter coercion and vote buying, while electronic voting machines and polling stations, they are under control of the election commission, and here you can avoid this. There is then also one mixed form, which is the so-called kiosk voting, which has not the control of the polling station election committee, and because it's happening, for example, in a phone booth, but you at least have a controlled hardware that you do not have to fear, or that the danger of Trojan horses that you might have on a home PC is very small. Okay, let me give you some examples for electronic voting machines. Here you can see two examples, one from Venezuela, which is basically a computer that has two large keyboards. You see the tablets on the right-hand side, the whiteboards, where a classical paper ballot is put on this tablet, and voters can cast their vote on this tablet, and they confirm it on the computer to the left. In Russia, they have a touch screen as well, where you see the ballot only on the screen, and you can touch it on that screen. And in the Russian system has, as well as the Venezuelan one, a paper printout on the side. But the difference in the Russian system is that it's on a consecutive paper roll, so the sequence of the votes is still recorded in the Russian system. And in Venezuela, you have different sheets of paper. Okay, I see already there has been one question coming in from Ivan Bondokov. Why would politicians want to implement electronic voting? Yeah, I don't have a slide on this here in this talk, but basically there are three different sets of reasons, or not three different sets, but for each group that is participating in an election, there are different reasons why to do electronic voting. When we think about voters, for them it can be enlarged participation, it can be accessibility, think of handicapped or blind people, as well as that it can enable them to make less wrong choices, so that they can only make valid ballots, for example. When we think about administrators, when they want to run elections, then or want to run electronic elections, they're mostly focused on ensuring that there is not that many wrong ballots, and they want to have integrity in the election, so ensuring that there is not that much fraud, that there are not that many problems with the elections. And then you have the third group of the politicians. When you think about electronic voting, there is, of course, when you look, for example, at the example of Estonia, here one clear motivator for doing internet voting was the first mover advantage. It was used as part of the nation branding of making Estonia an e-country. So they wanted to use that as an image, yes? And then the other factor that should always be taken into account is always for politicians, they want to be re-elected, yes? So when you have the issue of re-electing, when you look at electoral reform, then of course there are always certain perceptions in the mind of who is going to benefit. And here, of course, internet voting, when that is, for example, introduced, and that is a total different voter group, which always will give different ideas of who is going to benefit and who is not going to benefit from this new voter group. However, I would caution in this regard, because what we have seen so far is that internet voting mainly activates the already activated. So people that traditionally would vote on paper, they also vote electronically, and for them it might be easier to go to vote. because they have the internet voting. And so that there is actually going to be a shift, that's not really proven. And there are some studies by the Tartu University that actually claim that there is no shift towards a political body. But anyway, this perception is always there with politicians when they think about electoral reform, and it doesn't matter whether it's paper-based elections or electronic election, and that is always something that you have to debate very neutrally, and you have to be aware of that this might be motivation why a party is in favor or against electronic voting. So let me come to the second method of electronic voting, which is internet voting. As I said before, it's the most complex one, the most complicated one, because you need to ensure the integrity of the voter as well as the counting of the vote, and you have to separate somehow the identity from the secrecy of the vote. And here there were two examples. One, of course, Estonia, which is going to have it's, if I'm not wrong, the 8th time that they're using electronic voting, internet voting this May during the European Union elections. And in Austria, where there were the student elections, where there was a lot of tension going on, and they both used a similar method, basically very similar to the postal voting, meaning that a double envelope scheme was used. Double envelope scheme means you first have the vote, you put that into one envelope that keeps the vote secret, you put that envelope into a second envelope that contains the name of the voter, and then you seal the second envelope. Then during the counting, you will open the first envelope, you check that if the voter is actually eligible to vote. If yes, then you take the ballot that contains a secret vote, envelope that contains the secret vote, and put it on a separate pile. Once you have all the envelopes together, you mix them, and then only you open the second ballot, the second envelope, and that is how you can ensure the anonymity in those two methods. That what I described was, of course, done electronically. When we talk about the overview of or the adoption of electronic voting, you can see that the continent of Africa so far is mainly discussing the use of electronic voting, and so far hasn't been used to my knowledge. But there are smaller projects every now and then, and they're discussed everywhere. In Russia, they're using actually all three forms of electronic voting machines. They're trialing internet voting. They're also using ballot scanners. Kazakhstan has used it in the past, electronic voting machines, and one country that probably has the largest number of electronic voting machines is India, which uses a very simple and very interesting system, but still, they're about to discuss to introduce voter verifiable audit trails that are additional paper printouts for voting machines. What is interesting is that the United States, which I like to call the election wonderland of electronic voting, because they use any kind of form of voting technology, may be a part of internet voting so far. They use electronic voting machines, they use scanners, they use pull lever machines, they used all sorts of ways of how to use technology in their voting process. With internet voting, they're so far a bit cautious. In Canada, you find it quite frequently used on local and municipal level. And in South America, you'll find it used in, for example, in the trials in Peru. You have uses of voting machines in Brazil and the whole of the country. They're also quite ambitious with that. And Australia is actually also quite forward-looking. But the only country so far to introduce internet voting fully in every single election is actually Estonia. So what are the key principles of electronic voting? And here I can say that the one that is really so crucial is the secrecy of the vote. And that really is very challenging about electronic systems, because when you have all the information available, then you have no possibility to ensure the secrecy of the vote. So you always have to hide one form of information or distribute the information to several entities. And that's what we all know from polling stations. Here you also separate the information to two entities. One is the voter list, the other one is the ballot box. The second one is the integrity of the results. The integrity of the results is the ensuring that the overall process of the elections is actually done properly. Yeah? And that actually means separation of the information into several entities, and that people are actually reporting the results honestly. Equality of the vote is important, meaning that every voting channel, meaning if you have internet voting and paper-based voting running at the same time, that both channels are treated equally. Universality of the vote, that is important. Everybody has access, actually, to the election. And here, internet voting can help you, for example, to enable also people living outside the country, which otherwise would have big trouble receiving all the voting information in time and returning, for example, the postal ballot, to enable them to participate in the election. The fifth one is actually a very, very challenging one, transparency, and it links back to the issue about the secrecy of the vote. How are you going to make sure that every voter is able to understand the electronic voting? Because there is a computer involved, and computers, they are working on bits and bytes, and we cannot see or touch bits and bytes. So making sure that people understand electronic voting is a very difficult effort, and actually transparency directly influences the accountability of the process, meaning that you actually are able to tell everyone what has happened, when, where, how, and by whom. And this will influence at the end public confidence in the voting process itself. So let me reiterate, public confidence is coming from new voting technologies or electronic voting. They don't build public confidence. They actually require public confidence. And in order to reach this public confidence, you need to build a step-by-step approach, meaning that you start very little and grow over time, step by step. And how do I mean that? I think that when you think about the introduction of electronic voting, you should always start with a feasibility study. I know that in the past in Bulgaria, there has been a lot of talk and a lot of thoughts about using electronic voting in various forms. There have been pilots. Nevertheless, you should always, when you really think about introducing it, start again with a feasibility study. Maybe not do it just with one electoral cycle, but you should start with a feasibility study. How are you going to be able to implement electronic voting in that concrete moment? Then in the second effort, you should do a pilot phase of exactly this method that you're going to use. You need to test it. You need to gain experience. You need to be able to understand how it influences your voting process. And last but not least, only in a later point in time, ideally in the third electoral cycle, you would do the rollout phase where people already trust the system, they're able to understand it, and they are fully aware of using it full time. I know that in the political realities, that often is very difficult to keep pace. And I know out of personal experience that you sometimes just want to do too many things at the same time. And here it's really important to caution oneself and say, okay, one step after another. So let me summarize this brief talk. You need to start early. Time always runs out. IT projects are so special, and IT projects always run late. The problem with elections is you cannot postpone an election only because the IT program is not ready. When the IT program is not ready, the e-voting is not ready, then you will run either with a bad e-voting system in election, which you shouldn't do, or you won't run it and have to postpone it. There have been examples in the past. So electronic elections are the most complex form of voting channels, and that is something you always need to keep in mind. You're not talking about the simple word application that you're going to start and you're going to enter any kind of details. No, electronic elections are so complex because you cannot apply the things that you normally do to secure your transaction-based system, which is keeping log files. If you keep log files with all the information that you need to debug the process, you're not going to have anonymous elections. And if you're not going to have anonymous elections, then the whole system didn't work. So you need to strip down on information, and you won't be able to debug the system. So you really have a very complex form, and you need one thing, which is time. So most often, e-voting is designed for more accurate and less fraudulent elections. But where internet voting actually works best is to enable voters to participate from any place of choice. And that is actually where the added value, in my opinion, lies. You can actually enable voters that otherwise wouldn't be able to participate in an election. So thanks for the summary. I already see there are some questions coming in. Let me just read out the first one from Stoyan Mihailov. Sorry if I pronounced your name not correctly. How we can ensure that the inactive voter will not transfer offline his voting rights, ID, password, even electronic signature to some active voter? As I said before, when we talk about internet voting, here you have no means to ensure that the voter in front of the PC is actually the voter that is eligible to vote. That really depends on the voter, him or herself, that they do not pass on their digital signature cards, for example. And in Estonia, they found the way of enabling the voter to cast as often a vote as possible until the end of the voting period. They have actually an enlarged voting period of 5 days when they can cast the internet vote. And you can cast a vote when you're under pressure to vote for a certain party, you just vote again. Or if you still feel unsure, you can go to the polling station, and if you vote on paper, that will cancel your internet vote. That's the answer from the Estonians, and the Norwegian have copied exactly the same model to cover against voter coercion and voter intimidation. So while you cannot make sure that it actually is the voter, you have certain ways of organizational security to ensure that if someone is under pressure, they can at least vote again and circumvent this problem. So that is just one effort to do so. The third question comes from Jordan Mikhailov. Estonia introduced open source code for voting. If anyone can see the code, isn't it dangerous for the safety of the vote? In Estonia, they have introduced a partial open source for their internet voting. They actually have released the source code of the server side of how the votes get calculated. And actually, it was quite good because by making the source code public, they found certain comments that were left in there, and so they improved the source code. And as always with cryptography, a secret system is not a secure system. Only an open system where it is known how it works is considered a secure system. And following that path, in Norway, they have released the whole of the source code. And so far, no hack or similar efforts have been detected that there was a problem with that. And actually, the Norwegian model is quite a good one because they have had such a transparent procurement process, the actual operation of the system, and that is quite impressive with their system. And I think that if you are sharing the source code, that's the way to go. And hopefully you have looked into that during the procurement, because if you don't do that during the procurement, the voting system vendors, they will not be very likely to share their source code with you. Okay, the fourth question, Lilia Mikhailova, is the implementation of e-voting somehow related to the type of electoral system? I mean, proportional or majoritarian voting systems. I can tell you that in theory, there is no limitation to what kind of electoral system, being proportional representation or majoritarian system, to whatever electoral system there is an electronic voting system should always be able to display that on their ballots. However, there is some implications on the performance sometimes, that when you have more complex ballots, for example, if you think about proportional systems that would also allow striking off candidates off the list, of adding candidates to one list, of adding candidates to a list of another party, then it gets quite complicated, and that sometimes gets a bit more difficult to implement. But no, I don't know of any reasons why e-voting should be linked to a certain type of electoral system. It's just sometimes a bit more difficult, sometimes a bit less difficult to implement, in particular when it comes to the display and the usability of the ballot sheets. Question number 5, Daniel Dimitrov. How much time does it take, e.g. based on Estonia's experience, to build and put into practice an electronic voting system? The Estonians started with discussing introducing internet voting in about, I think it was year 2000. And they started with a working group in 2002. They wanted to be finished actually quite earlier. In the end, they managed to have it in place in 2005 when they used it for the first time for the municipal elections in Estonia. So it took them 5 years from the political idea to the actual implementation. And I would say that is a realistic one when you consider the smallness of the country of Estonia. I mean, we talk about 1.3 million inhabitants, and one fourth of them living in Tallinn. And so this really was a benefit of Estonia. Normally, I would say, no, it's really some 2 electoral cycles sounds to me quite ideal. So if your electoral cycle is some 4 years, I would say some 8 years is a good time period. If you do it shorter, the only thing you will it will influence 2 things: the quality of the product as well as the public confidence. If you leave more time, if you have more resources available, then you can always get to a better product. Think about the Swiss experience. In Switzerland, they have chosen a step-by-step approach, and they have started in the year 1998 with the political discussion of internet voting. Now we're in the year 2014. They have had some 70 internet votings on a cantonal basis. They had one on the national level, but not for everyone, only for about 10% of the voters. And they have come up with a 30-year plan. So they want to have it in 2028 when it's fully fledged available to everyone. And their plan is in the near future to enable it for everyone living abroad. So they also take it very slow. But the Swiss, again, they always have a very different approach to democratic innovations. Are there any further questions? Okay, I see a 6th question by Mirko Christoph. Sorry for pronouncing your name wrong if I did so. Both types of voting are making favor to some politician, or let's say voting can be manipulated, no matter E or P. So the question comes that by e-voting, we'd like to favorize the smart guys who are more educated and have better PC skills. Do you agree? Okay, that's an interesting question. Maybe let's first go to the question about manipulation. Yes, it's true. There is no 100% security in either way, paper-based or electronic system. What you have, however, with electronic or with paper-based systems, it's very easy to manipulate one vote, and it's very hard to manipulate all votes. Yeah. With electronic voting, it's very different. With electronic voting, it's very hard to manipulate one vote, but once you're able to manipulate one vote, it's very easy to manipulate all the other votes as well. So these 2 efforts, they're very different. So you can also say that electronic voting is to some degree more secure because you can usually control the entity where the votes are stored better with higher efforts. But of course, you also have a higher risk. And that's why certain countries have introduced limits to the number of voters that can actually use electronic voting. And so this is the one thing. The second thing is, who is more likely to vote when you offer electronic elections? And here I would say, yes, you will have, it's more likely that the people that are IT literate, that are able to use computers, are more likely to vote using electronic channels, and they're in consequence also less likely to use paper-based processes. So if you look at the experience from Estonia here, there are claims that there is no political bias. I would say that probably if you look at the results, it does shift actually which voter uses which voting channel. And this answer always has to depend, and we don't have real scenarios where you have a test one election without electronic voting and at the same time an election with internet voting. You cannot test that. But there are speculations in every area, but I would say still the internet voting is going to activate the already activated, the ones that have already participated in elections. So the second part of your question, do you believe that the people who are manipulating the voting and are particularly interested to win would let the smart guys do their type of voting? Would the masters of the puppet theater be motivated to make e-voting real, knowing that this will have bad influence on their ambitions? Okay, so this is the question if the administrators of the electronic voting system would start manipulations. I would say that with electronic systems, it's much more difficult to manipulate than with paper-based election, as I mentioned before. And it's more traceable if you actually are only the administrator. On the other hand, of course, it always depends what you are actually having your hands on. If you have no transparency at all, then this manipulation might be quite easy. If you have a relatively good transparency and you have good observation, you have well-educated people that actually watch the decision makers, then I don't think you have to fear that much. You just have to be smart and you have to be able to check them. If there is a limited amount of transparency, I would start to become suspicious. Okay, the last question here is by Daniel Dimitrov. Is it possible to buy an electronic voting system, or do you have to start from scratch if you want to build it? Yes, you can buy electronic voting system, maybe electronic voting machines or internet voting systems. There are vendors out there. But of course, it's clear that when you produce a voting system by yourself or you adapt an existing system to your own requirements, then you always end up with a better system, especially if you open it up to academic challenges and you develop it together with academics. One example here is, of course, the Norwegian system, which was an open competitive procurement process where the companies, they could bid, and then there was the government that was running the procurement had the possibility to develop the requirements on the go. And that way they ended up with a quite sophisticated system. I would probably say it's one of the most advanced internet voting systems that are out there right now, that they ran end-to-end verifiability, meaning they gave the voter the possibility to verify whether or not his or her vote was actually cast as intended. And that is actually something that Estonia is only introducing or introduced in last year's municipal election for the first time, and they had to catch up. So make or buy decision in terms of electronic voting, probably somewhere in between. Get an existing system adapted to your requirements and have it in an open, transparent way where source code is shared is probably one of the best ways to go forward. So I'm at the end of the list of my questions. Okay, one more. What are the next steps? What is the future in electronic voting? The future in electronic voting, I would say, is really this enhanced transparency, this enhanced accountability that we call end-to-end verifiability. It all started with paper-based or with electronic voting machines, which were fully electronic, and we had no way of actually doing a recount. And so the movement in the US started to request to have paper printouts of the vote next to the voting machine. As I mentioned before, the Venezuelan system or the Venezuelan system has exactly this paper printouts. And then academics started to take this principle of paper printouts, of individual verifiability of the electronic vote, to transform that into a fully electronic election. And that is the so-called end-to-end verifiability, where it is possible using cryptography, which of course makes it even more difficult to understand, to have this cryptography, using cryptography to allow the voter to actually verify whether or not his or her vote was cast as intended. How does it work in Norway? In Norway, the election authority also has the mobile phone number of the voter. And once a voter has cast their vote online, the voter gets a return code, gets a code sent by text message to their phone. And the voter has the possibility to check this code with a code that is printed on the back of his voting card that he has been mailed before the election, if that code corresponds to a certain party. In Norway, they can also vote several times, so also there is not that much of a problem to be able to prove your vote to a third party, like voter coercion. But that is actually the future of electronic voting. End-to-end verifiability, I would say, is the big topic right now in how to make that happen. Okay, so I think I'm at the end of my list of questions. I thank you very much for the very interactive presentation. I like the way, especially also of having questions right away. That was very good, and I liked it very much. And I'm looking forward to what is happening in Bulgaria. And you know how to contact me. Here you can find my email address, robert@krimър.ee. I'm working at the Tallinn Technical University in Estonia. Thank you very much for this. Best.
Аз също искам да благодаря специално на доктор Кримър, че се съгласи да направи тази лекция за българската аудитория по въпроса за електронното гласуване. Една изключително важна тема, наред с това как въобще трябва да бъде реформирана избирателната система, за да може тя да включи по-голям кръг от български гласове и да подкрепи истинското демократично представителство, което суверена в България изисква. Ние ще продължим с темата за електронното гласуване в четвъртък от 7, когато ще разгледаме политическия контекст за или против електронно гласуване. Гледайте ни отново. Междувременно можете да задавате, разбира се, въпросите си на Facebook страницата на MoveBG, както и в сайта на организацията ни.